In September of 2018, soybean harvest had just begun across much of western Kansas. For farmers in that part of the state, harvest season was one of the most demanding times of the entire year. Months of planting, fertilizing, and waiting finally came down to a few narrow weeks when crops had to be brought out of the field before weather changed. When the soybeans were ready, there was very little room for delay. One of the farmers working through harvest that season was Mark Ellison. Mark was 57 years old and farmed about 1,300 acres of land roughly 20 miles outside the small town of Hutchinson. Like many farmers in the region, Mark ran a mixture of equipment on his farm. A combine for harvesting, a grain cart tractor to carry beans from the field to waiting trucks, and several other machines used throughout the year. The combine did the cutting, but the tractor running the grain cart kept the entire harvest moving. If that tractor stopped working, the entire operation slowed down immediately. On the morning of September 24th, the weather was nearly perfect for harvest. Clear skies stretched across the fields. A light wind moved through the dry soybean plants. Mark's son Tyler was operating the combine while Mark drove the grain cart tractor beside him. The machine Mark was driving was a 2015 John Deere 8295R. It had been purchased new 3 years earlier for just over $240,000. The tractor had roughly 2,100 hours on the engine. It had never caused serious problems before. That morning the harvest was moving smoothly. The combine cut through the soybeans row after row. Every few minutes Tyler would signal for the grain cart. Mark would pull the tractor alongside the combine while the unloading auger poured soybeans into the cart. Then Mark would drive the cart to the edge of the field where a truck waited to haul the grain to the elevator. It was a routine farmers repeated hundreds of times every harvest season. By mid-afternoon, the crew had already finished nearly 60 acres. Another large section of field still waited ahead. If the weather stayed dry, Mark expected to finish most of the harvest within the next several days. But at 3:17 p.m., something unusual happened. Mark was driving the tractor beside the combine when the display screen inside the cab suddenly flashed a warning message. A loud alert tone sounded through the cab speakers. Mark glanced down at the digital monitor mounted beside the steering wheel. The message on the screen read, "Machine function restricted. Contact dealer." For a moment Mark thought it might just be a sensor warning. Modern tractors displayed dozens of alerts during normal operation. Hydraulic pressure, fuel filters, temperature sensors. But this message was different. As soon as the warning appeared, the tractor immediately reduced its speed. Mark pushed the throttle forward. Nothing happened. The tractor continued rolling slowly across the field. Then the transmission locked into a low power mode. Within seconds, the tractor stopped moving completely. The grain cart sat half full of soybeans. The combine behind him had to shut down its unloading auger. Tyler's voice came through the radio. "Dad, what happened?" Mark looked down at the screen again. The message had not changed. Machine function restricted. He turned the ignition key off and restarted the tractor. The diesel engine fired back to life. But the moment the display finished booting up, the same message returned. The transmission refused to engage. The tractor would not move. The combine idled quietly behind him in the middle of the field. Soybeans rustled in the wind around the stalled machine. Tyler drove the combine closer and shut down the header. He climbed down from the cab and walked across the field. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. Mark pointed toward the display screen. Tyler leaned inside the cab and read the message. "Machine function restricted." He frowned. "What does that mean?" Mark shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure." Modern farm equipment had become far more complicated than the machines Mark had grown up using. Decades earlier, most tractor problems involved mechanical parts, fuel pumps, hydraulics, gearboxes. But newer tractors relied heavily on computer systems that controlled nearly every function of the machine. Sometimes those systems produced warnings that farmers could not fix themselves. Mark pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the local dealership. The dealership had sold him the tractor 3 years earlier. After a few rings, the service department answered. Mark explained what had happened. The technician asked several questions. "What message do you see on the display?" Mark read it again. "Machine function restricted." There was a short pause on the other end of the line. Then the technician asked another question. "Did you recently replace any sensors or hydraulic components on the tractor?" Mark thought for a moment. "No. Nothing recently." The technician spoke carefully. "That message usually means the tractor has entered a software lock mode." Mark frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" The technician hesitated before answering. "It means the system detected something it doesn't recognize, and the tractor limits certain functions until a technician checks it." Mark looked back at the silent machine sitting in the field. "So how do we fix it?" The answer was simple, but it wasn't good news. "You'll need a technician with a diagnostic laptop to unlock the system." Mark glanced across the soybean field. The harvest had stopped completely. "How soon can someone get here?" he asked. The technician checked the service schedule. "Well, our nearest field technician is currently working about 60 miles away." Mark looked at the clouds beginning to build on the horizon. Weather forecasts had already mentioned rain arriving later in the week. Every day of harvest mattered. "So when can he get here?" Mark asked. There was another short pause. "Probably tomorrow morning." Mark ended the call and looked across the field again. The combine sat silent. The soybeans rustled in the wind, and the tractor that kept the entire harvest moving was now completely locked by a computer system Mark couldn't control. After Mark Ellison ended the call with the dealership, the soybean field suddenly felt very quiet. The combine idled beside the grain cart. The tractor still sat frozen in the middle of the rows. The warning message remained on the display screen inside the cab. "Machine function restricted. Contact dealer." Mark climbed down from the tractor and walked around the machine slowly. For most of his life, when a tractor stopped working, the problem was usually mechanical. A loose belt, a clogged fuel line, a broken hydraulic hose. Farmers were used to fixing those kinds of issues themselves. But this situation was different. The engine still ran perfectly. The hydraulics worked. All the physical parts of the machine seemed fine. Yet the tractor refused to move. Not because something had broken, but because the computer system inside the machine had restricted it. Tyler stood beside the grain cart looking out across the field. "So what now?" he asked. Mark looked back toward the combine. "We wait," he said. But waiting during harvest was the one thing farmers hated most. The soybeans were ready. The weather forecast already showed rain arriving within 2 days. If the crop stayed in the field too long, the quality could drop. Moisture could damage the beans. Every hour of delay mattered. For the moment, there wasn't much they could do. Mark drove the combine slowly toward the edge of the field and parked it beside the gravel road. The locked tractor and grain cart stayed where they were. The dealership technician wouldn't arrive until the following morning. As the sun began dropping toward the horizon, Mark drove back to the house in his pickup truck. That evening he called the dealership again to confirm the technician's arrival. The service manager explained the situation more clearly. Modern tractors like the John Deere 8295 are relied on dozens of electronic sensors and control systems. Those systems monitored everything: transmission pressure, hydraulic flow, engine performance, and even the communication between different computer modules inside the tractor. If the system detected something it considered abnormal, it could enter a restricted mode. In some cases, the tractor would continue running at reduced power. In other cases, the system could prevent the tractor from operating entirely until the issue was checked. The dealership technician would need to connect a diagnostic laptop directly to the tractor's onboard computer. That laptop would communicate with the tractor's software and identify the cause of the restriction. Once the issue was verified, The technician could reset the system and restore normal operation. Mark listened carefully. "So the tractor isn't actually broken?" he asked. "No," the service manager said. "It's more like the system locked itself for safety." Mark thought about that answer for a moment. The machine sitting in his field cost more than $200,000. And yet he couldn't make it move without a laptop from the dealership. After the call ended, Mark stepped outside the house and looked across the dark field stretching beyond the yard. Harvest seasons had always carried pressure. But the machines farmers relied on had changed dramatically over the years. The tractors Mark's father had used decades earlier were simple by comparison. If something stopped working, a farmer could usually repair it with basic tools. But the equipment now running across American farms had become something else entirely. Powerful, efficient, and deeply connected to complex software systems that controlled nearly every function. Mark went to bed that night hoping the technician would arrive early the next morning. Because every hour the tractor stayed locked in that soybean field meant another hour of harvest lost. The next morning the dealership service truck finally arrived just after 9:30 a.m. The technician stepped out carrying a rugged laptop and a diagnostic cable. He walked across the field toward the tractor and climbed into the cab. Within seconds, he connected the laptop to the tractor's service port beneath the dashboard. Lines of data appeared across the screen. Error codes, sensor readings, system logs. After a few minutes, the technician nodded. "Found it," he said. Mark stood beside the tractor. "What was it?" The technician pointed toward the laptop. One of the hydraulic pressure sensors sent a signal the system didn't recognize. The software locked the transmission to prevent damage. He typed a few commands into the laptop. Then he restarted the tractor's control system. The display screen rebooted. The warning message disappeared. Mark climbed back into the cab and pressed the throttle. The tractor moved forward again. Just like that. After nearly 18 hours of delay, the machine was running again. Mark looked at the technician. "That's it." The technician nodded. "That's it." The entire repair had taken less than 10 minutes. But before the technician packed up his laptop, he handed Mark a printed service invoice. At the bottom of the page, the total charge read, $1,180. Mark looked at the paper for a moment. The tractor had stopped in the middle of harvest because of a sensor reading. And the only way to unlock it had been a computer connected by the dealership. For Mark Ellison, the harvest was about to continue. But the story of that locked tractor was only beginning. Once the technician left the field, Mark Ellison climbed back into the cab of the John Deere 8295R and drove the grain cart tractor toward the combine. The machine now moved normally again. The transmission shifted smoothly. The engine pulled just as it had the day before. From the outside, nothing about the tractor seemed different. But the harvest had already lost nearly a full day of work. And during harvest season, time was everything. Tyler started the combine again. The header dropped into the soybeans. Within minutes, the machine began cutting rows once more. Mark drove the tractor alongside the combine while the unloading auger poured soybeans into the grain cart. The harvest was moving again. But the delay had created a problem. The weather forecast that morning had changed. A storm system was now expected to arrive earlier than predicted. Meteorologists were calling for heavy rain within 36 hours. For farmers harvesting soybeans, rain could slow everything down. Wet fields made it harder for machines to move. Moisture in the crop could lower grain quality. And if the weather stayed bad for several days, harvest could be delayed even longer. That meant the next day and a half had suddenly become critical. Mark and Tyler worked late into the evening that night. The combine headlights cut through the dark field. The grain cart moved back and forth beside the machine. Truck after truck hauled soybeans toward the grain elevator. By midnight, they had managed to finish another 40 acres. But there were still hundreds of acres left to harvest. The following morning, the work started again before sunrise. The machines rolled into the field while the sky was still gray. The soybeans were dry. The soil conditions were good, and this time the tractor continued running without interruption. But the story of what had happened the previous afternoon had already begun spreading. That morning, Mark stopped briefly at the local grain elevator to deliver a load of soybeans. A few other farmers stood nearby drinking coffee and waiting for their trucks to unload. One of them asked how harvest was going. Mark shrugged. "Lost most of yesterday." "What happened?" "My grain cart tractor locked itself." The farmer looked confused. "What do you mean locked?" Mark explained what had happened. The message on the screen. The tractor refusing to move. The technician arriving with a laptop. The 10-minute repair. The $1,180 service bill. The small group of farmers listened quietly. One of them shook his head. "So the tractor wasn't broken?" "No," Mark said. "It just needed the computer reset." Another farmer leaned against his pickup truck. "That's the problem with these new machines," he said. "They're basically computers with wheels." The group laughed slightly, but the conversation continued. One man pointed toward the field outside town. "So if your tractor stops like that during harvest, you can't fix it yourself?" Mark shook his head. "Nope. Dealer has to unlock it." The farmers exchanged looks. Many of them owned similar tractors, machines built within the same generation of modern farm equipment. Equipment that relied on software systems to control nearly every mechanical function. The conversation eventually shifted back to harvest. But the story stuck with them. Later that afternoon, the same story was repeated again at the local cafe where farmers gathered for lunch. Then again at the feed store. And again at another farm outside town. It spread quietly, the same way most stories traveled through rural communities. Not through social media, not through headlines, but through simple conversations between farmers. By the end of the week, most of the farming community around Hutchinson had heard some version of the story. A tractor that had locked itself in the middle of harvest. A farmer who couldn't move it without a laptop from the dealership. And a repair that took 10 minutes to fix but cost more than $1,000. For Mark Ellison, harvest eventually finished just before the rain arrived. The soybeans were delivered. The fields were cleared. But the story of that locked tractor continued traveling far beyond that single field. Because the farmers who heard it all asked themselves the same quiet question. If a tractor could stop working because of software, who really controlled the machine? And that question would soon begin changing how some farmers in the area thought about the equipment they were buying. At the grain elevator, farmers mentioned it while waiting for trucks to unload. At the local cafe, someone repeated the story over breakfast. At the co-op supply store, another farmer brought it up while buying seed and fertilizer. Each time the story was told, the same details came up. A 2015 John Deere 8295R. A warning message on the screen. The tractor refusing to move in the middle of harvest. A technician arriving with a laptop. And a 10-minute reset that cost $1,180. Most farmers listening to the story reacted the same way. At first, they laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because it sounded almost unbelievable. For generations, farmers had been able to repair most of their own equipment. Engines could be rebuilt. Hydraulic pumps could be replaced. Transmission parts could be repaired. Even complicated mechanical problems usually had practical solutions. But the idea of a tractor refusing to move because of a computer system was something many farmers were still getting used to. A few days after harvest ended, Mark stopped at the cafe in town early one morning. Several farmers were already sitting at a table near the window. Coffee cups sat beside stacks of farm magazines and folded newspapers. When Mark walked in, one of the men looked up and smiled. "So you're the guy with the tractor that locked itself?" Mark laughed quietly and sat down. "Looks like that story got around." Another farmer leaned forward. "What exactly happened?" Mark explained it again. The message on the display. The tractor stopping in the field. The technician arriving with the laptop. When he finished, the group sat quietly for a moment. Then one of the older farmers spoke. "You know what bothers me about that?" Mark looked up. "What's that?" "If a machine I paid $200,000 for can stop working because of software, that means I can't fix it myself anymore." No one at the table argued with him, because they all understood what he meant. Modern farm equipment had become incredibly advanced, more powerful, more efficient, more comfortable to operate. But those improvements had also made machines more dependent on complex electronic systems. Systems that often required dealership computers to diagnose and repair. For some farmers, that wasn't a major concern. They relied on dealerships for service anyway. But for others, especially those used to repairing their own equipment, the idea created a different kind of worry. What happened if a machine locked itself during planting season? Or in the middle of harvest again? What if the nearest technician was hundreds of miles away? And how many other systems inside modern tractors could stop working because of software restrictions? Over the next several months, Mark noticed something interesting happening around the area. Farmers began talking more carefully about the tractors they planned to buy. Not just horsepower, not just fuel efficiency, but also something else. Repair access. Some farmers asked dealers whether certain machines could be serviced independently. Others started looking more closely at older equipment that relied less on software systems. It wasn't a dramatic change. No one was abandoning modern tractors overnight. But the conversations had started shifting. The story of one locked tractor during harvest had planted a small seed of doubt in the minds of several farmers. And once farmers started thinking about that question, they didn't stop. Because for people whose entire livelihood depended on machines working when they were needed most, control mattered. And the story of Mark Ellison's tractor had raised a question many farmers were now quietly asking themselves. If the computer inside the tractor controlled the machine, who really owned it? Over the next several months, the conversation about Mark Ellison's locked tractor slowly spread beyond the small farming community outside Hutchinson, Kansas. It didn't happen all at once. There were no headlines, no major announcements, just the quiet movement of information from one farmer to another. Someone mentioned it while waiting in line at the grain elevator. Another farmer repeated the story while buying parts at the co-op. A truck driver who had delivered soybeans to the elevator told the story at another farm 30 miles away. And little by little, the same question kept appearing in those conversations. If a tractor could lock itself because of software, how much control did the farmer really have over the machine? For many farmers, modern tractors were essential. The power, precision agriculture systems, and efficiency improvements had made farming far more productive than it had been decades earlier. But the systems inside those machines had also become incredibly complex. Electronic control modules monitored nearly every component. Hydraulic pressure, engine performance, transmission shifts. Sensor data traveled through networks of computers inside the machine. When everything worked correctly, the technology made farming easier. But when something unusual happened, the system sometimes required specialized diagnostic tools that only dealerships possessed. A few weeks after harvest ended, Mark visited the local dealership again. This time he wasn't bringing in a tractor for repair. He had simply stopped to pick up a few filters and maintenance parts for the winter. The same service manager who had helped him earlier recognized him immediately. "Your tractor still running all right?" the manager asked. Mark nodded. "Runs fine." The service manager smiled. "Those machines are good tractors." Mark didn't disagree. The tractor itself had never been unreliable. But the experience during harvest had left him thinking about something he had never considered before. The tractor was powerful, efficient, and capable of doing everything he needed. But it also relied on software systems that could limit how the machine operated. When Mark drove home that afternoon, he passed several other farms along the highway. Most of them were running similar equipment. Modern tractors. Large combines. Machines designed to harvest thousands of acres each season. Every one of those machines depended on complex software systems. And for most farmers, that wasn't necessarily a problem. Until something went wrong at the worst possible moment. The following spring, when planting season began, Mark's tractor worked perfectly. The fields were planted on schedule. No warning messages appeared on the display. The tractor ran exactly as it should. But even though the machine continued performing well, Mark noticed something had changed in the conversations among farmers around him. Whenever new equipment purchases came up, farmers now asked different kinds of questions. Not just about horsepower or fuel consumption, but about something else. Control. Could the farmer diagnose problems independently? Could software issues be reset without a dealership laptop? How much access did the owner actually have to the systems inside the machine? Those questions didn't always have simple answers. But they showed something important. The story of one locked tractor had made farmers think differently about the machines they depended on. And sometimes a single experience was enough to start that kind of shift. Because when harvest season arrived again the following year, every farmer in the area wanted to be certain of one thing: that when their machines entered the field, they would keep moving. By the time the next harvest season arrived, the story of Mark Ellison's tractor had become one of those stories farmers repeated when discussing modern equipment. Not because it had caused a disaster. Mark still harvested his soybeans. The tractor was repaired. The farm continued operating normally. But the event had revealed something many farmers had not fully considered before. For most of agricultural history, farmers had controlled nearly every part of their equipment. If something broke, they repaired it. If a machine needed adjustment, they made the change themselves. Ownership meant control. But modern tractors had changed that relationship. Machines like the 2015 John Deere 8295R were incredibly advanced. They used powerful engines, precise hydraulic systems, GPS guidance, and sophisticated software to improve productivity. Those improvements allowed farmers to plant and harvest more acres than ever before. Yet those same systems also meant the machines relied on software that farmers themselves could not always access. In Mark's case, the tractor had not failed mechanically. Nothing inside the engine had broken. No gears had snapped. No hydraulic lines had burst. The machine had stopped because the computer inside the tractor had detected a signal it didn't recognize. And until a technician arrived with a laptop to reset the system, the tractor simply refused to move. The repair had taken only a few minutes. But it had stopped an entire harvest operation for nearly a full day. After that experience, Mark still used the tractor every season. The machine continued performing well. But when the time eventually came to consider replacing equipment, Mark approached the decision differently than before. He still valued modern technology. Precision farming tools had become an important part of agriculture. But he also wanted to understand how much control he would have over the machine he owned. Other farmers in the region had begun thinking about the same issue. Some chose to continue purchasing the newest models available. Others started keeping older tractors longer. A few farmers simply paid closer attention to how service and software systems worked before making large equipment purchases. None of those decisions happened suddenly. But the conversations had clearly changed. The story of one tractor stopping during harvest had made farmers ask a simple but important question. When a farmer buys a machine that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, who truly controls it? The farmer who owns it, or the software that operates it? For Mark Ellison, the experience had been frustrating. But it had also been a reminder of how much farming technology had evolved. Machines were more powerful than ever. But they were also more complicated. And sometimes, the most important part of a modern tractor wasn't the engine under the hood. It was the computer running inside the cab. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our growing YouTube family. We share real farm stories about tractors, farmers, auctions, and the unexpected moments that happen out in the countryside. And if you've ever had a machine break down at the worst possible time during planting or harvest, tell us about it in the comments. Your story might be the next one we share.